Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Washington Brief for Tuesday, October 1. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors this webcast. Dr. Jenkins is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He has led many successful fact-finding trips to Korea for policy experts and peace initiatives to the Middle East for Universal Peace Federation. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for all you do for the Washington Brief. Today's topic is national security dominoes and the next U.S. will immediately face. Tensions are rising in China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran, sometimes referred to as an axis of authoritarianism. The likelihood of conflict is also increasing. How is this very dangerous situation going to unfold? Our experts today will shed light on this and also possibly give us a path of understanding of the best way for the next president to respond. Our moderator today is Ambassador Robert Joseph. He is currently the senior scholar of the National Institute for Public Policy. He has served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security, has extensive experience in the White House advising the president on nuclear nonproliferation, arms control, regional security, and developing and coordinating policies and strategies for deterring threats against the United States. Our panelist is Dr. Alexandre Mansourov, an adjunct professor of studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's also an adjunct professor of Korean Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. We're honored to present to you today our guest panelist, Mr. Fred Fleitz, who serves as the vice chair of America First Policy Institute's Center for American Security. He's also a Newsmax TV contributor. Fred served in 2018 as Deputy Assistant to President Donald Trump and Chief of Staff of the National Security Council. He also served in the U.S. national security positions for 25 years with the CIA, the DIA, Department of State, and he's a prolific writer who has written extensively on the Iranian and North Korean nuclear programs, the growing threat to U.S. security from China, and the politicization of U.S. intelligence on many other national security topics. He's the author and editor of 7 books, including Defending Against Biothreats, What Can We Learn from Coronavirus Pandemic to Enhance U.S. Defenses Against Pandemics and Biological Weapons. So, Ambassador Joseph, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Let me first say that I appreciate the opportunity to fill in for Ambassador Detrani. Joe is a longtime colleague and friend, and I know from experience that no one does a better job at moderating the Washington Brief than Ambassador Detrani, and we look forward to his return. Today's program, as Dr. Jenkins mentioned, is going to focus on the threats and tests that will confront the next president. The election is a little more than 30 days away, so our program couldn't be any more timely than it is. We're most fortunate to have with us our guest, Fred Fleitz. Fred is also a longtime friend and colleague. We worked together at the State Department during the second term of Bush 43. Fred was one of the very few go-to guys that I could rely on to get the job done, even if that meant taking on the entrenched, the ossified bureaucracy at Foggy Bottom. I should have said especially if it meant taking on the bureaucracy, because I think Fred enjoyed doing just that. As Michael mentioned, Fred has extensive experience in the interagency, having served not just at the State Department, but also within the intelligence community and at the NSC staff under President Trump, in addition serving as a key staffer in the House intelligence community. So he is well prepared for today's discussion. And in and out of government, Fred has earned the reputation as a true strategic thinker. And we've asked him to help us more accurately the world disorder. I'd like to set the stage for Fred's analysis with two quotes. The first is from the Bipartisan Commission on the National Defense Strategy, which reported out this past July. And I quote, "The United States confronts the most serious and the most challenging threats since the end of World War II. The United States, in short order, could be drawing into a war across multiple theaters with peer and non-peer adversaries, and it could lose." End of quote. The second quote is also from a bipartisan commission, in this case, the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States, which reported out in April. And it concluded that, and here I quote again, "America's defense strategy and strategic posture must change in order to properly defend its vital interests and improve strategic stability with China and Russia. We are not prepared to address the threats from Russia and China. We are not prepared to address those threats, to deter and to defeat them, including when these two adversaries may act together simultaneously." I think both of those commissions have produced very powerful and very relevant for our discussion conclusions and recommendations. And whether we describe our adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, principally as the axis of authoritarianism, or more recently, some are calling it the quad of chaos, we need to recognize that we are already under attack by our enemies, individually and collectively. Enemies who seek to bring down the post-World War II international order using every means at their disposal, whether that's the threat of using nuclear weapons, whether it's armed aggression, cyber, and even interference in our presidential election. So with that cheery introduction, let me ask our guest panelists to do three things. First, address the current security environment. Are we witnessing a replay of the 1930s when Hitler's Germany and the Japanese militarists sought to create and dominate a new international order? We know the result was World War II. Second, to provide his assessment of what needs to be done to meet the spectrum of threats that we face. What must be done to deter, to defend, and to defeat our enemies? And third, to give his view on the question of what to expect from the two presidential candidates, Vice President Harris and former President Trump. Fred, over to you.
Thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here today. I wish Ambassador Detrani the best. Hope he gets well soon. He's a good friend. And Bob, I was your chief of staff when you were Undersecretary for Arms Control. We had some great times together. And I tell you, fighting that bureaucracy was a battle I'll never forget. And frankly, we're preparing to fight a new bureaucracy if Donald Trump wins the presidency across the board. So, Bob, I think we'll be talking. I guess I'd like to start by talking about what we've been seeing recently with Israel. You know, in the United States, people are procedures exploded and walkie-talkies exploded. Over 2,000 Hezbollah members were maimed and 20 to 30 were killed. And then recently we had this incredible pinprick strike by bunker buster bombs that killed the head of Hezbollah in Beirut. And the perception right now is that this is a tremendous success and we should be jubilant over what Israel is doing to change the security dynamics of the Middle East and to put Hezbollah, an Iranian terrorist proxy, on its heels. And there's a lot of truth to that. But at the end of the day, it represents a failure of American deterrence. It represents a deterioration of global security because of the weakest president in American history that has not only failed to promote American security worldwide, he has undermined our security relationships with our allies, and he has emboldened our enemies. Our relationship with Israel has been deteriorating steadily under this president. Think about last week after we heard that the head of Hezbollah had been killed. What did the Secretary of State do? He immediately had a press conference and said, well, let's have a ceasefire. Let's de-escalate. Let's have peace talks. And of course, we all agree with those things in principle, but we've seen the pattern over and over again that when Israel takes steps to defend its security, the Biden administration runs out and calls for a ceasefire and peace talks. Where were calls for those peace talks and ceasefire and de-escalation when Hezbollah was firing thousands of missiles on northern Israel and forcing over 60,000 Israelis to leave their homes? There's really a distortion of priorities. There's an undermining of global security of American deterrence. What we're seeing right now in the Middle East is Israel is establishing Israeli deterrence because there's a power vacuum, because America has not been to defend its interests and the interests of our allies. And so what we're seeing is basically what Israel has to do, but it isn't an ideal situation. We're seeing, frankly, the result of a foreign policy by a weak administration that can be best described as frivolous. After all, we know early on, Joe Biden made it clear that the priority of his national security strategy was climate change, not China, not Iran, not Russia, not nuclear proliferation. And it went down from there. We had the administration trying to appease Iran. Iran is now hundreds of billions of dollars richer than it was when Donald Trump left office because this administration hasn't enforced oil sanctions against Iran. And who bought that oil? China, which is helping embolden China, at the same time. That money to Iran is being used to finance terrorism, to finance an unprecedented surge in Iran's nuclear program. The Hamas terrorist attack against Israel on October 7, 2023 would not have happened if there was not the funding that Iran received because of Biden's incompetence. And we're seeing similar instability around the world. When our enemies know that when they strike one of our allies and we're going to call our ally to de-escalate, we can see instability simply growing and growing. I think there's no question that Putin invaded Ukraine because of the weakness of Joe Biden. Bear in mind that Putin invaded neighboring countries during 3 of 4 successive presidents, but not Donald Trump. Because he saw Trump as decisive. He saw Trump as someone who would respond unpredictably if there was a Russian incursion during his presidency. And the consequences of this invasion is having enormous problems for global security. Russia is now isolated. Russia is being driven into the arms of China. We now have this new Russia-China axis and alliance, which Iran and North Korea are becoming members of. President Biden hasn't spoken to Russian President Putin since February 2022. He's called Putin a war criminal. He's likened him to Hamas. Now, those of us watching this program, we may agree with those characterizations. But in the real world, American presidents have to deal with the heads of state of our adversaries, and demonizing them as terrorists, refusing to speak to them, is not a way to end the worst armed conflict in Europe since World War II, and a conflict with a state that has the largest nuclear arsenal on earth. We have a situation right now with Ukraine where the Ukrainians have taken some Russian territory. They're losing ground in the east of the country, and they are pressing to fire rockets and missiles deeper and deeper into Russian territory. Putin is threatening to respond with nuclear weapons. This administration doesn't seem to understand what this involves, and it has refused to provide a strategy that it was required to provide when it agreed to the last supplemental for military aid to Ukraine, a strategy for how do we get to an end of this war? How do we help Ukraine win? The reality is Ukraine is not going to win this war on the ground. This is a long-term war of attrition. Ukraine will ultimately lose. It's already running out of troops. None of us want to see that. That was Zelensky recently in New York. He said, I'm going to have a solution to this war that's fair for both sides. Trump is deliberately not saying, I want Ukraine to win. Not that he wants Ukraine to lose, but Trump has said several times, the key here is to stop the killing. Let's not talk about winners or losers. And frankly, I might add, I'm not speaking for Trump, but I'm speaking what I hope Trump will do, is to set up a diplomatic process to resolve this war through peace talks and not continue a war of attrition that is simply killing a whole generation of young Ukrainian men. We've seen a situation spread into Asia. U.S.-China relations have not been this bad in a long time. We've seen a sharp increase in tensions against Taiwan in the South China Sea. We've seen a record number of missile tests by North Korea. And our diplomacy with China has been subpar, to say the least. Henry Kissinger said about a year ago, a few months before he died, that U.S.-Russia and U.S.-China relationships need high-level diplomacy, constant high-level diplomacy, and working-level groups to talk about what's going on to lower tensions before they spin out of control. Specifically, Kissinger said there has to be working-level U.S.-China groups to talk about the tensions in the region and how to de-escalate. There's simply been an absence of diplomacy and absence of dialogue during this administration, and I think the approach that a new Trump administration will take, whether it's U.S. or China, U.S. or Russia, is tough policies, stand up to our adversaries, but also talk to them. And I don't think that the Biden administration understands that you can do both at the same time, and that this is really crucial to lower the tensions and to try to get to a control. One of the most dangerous developments we have right now is this axis between Russia and China, and it will simply continue to grow until we find a different way of approaching this. One way to approach it is first to end the war in Ukraine, which Trump would like to do before he's inaugurated. If this happens, this may weaken the Russia-China alliance. This may weaken the Russia alliance with North Korea. There may be opportunities long-term, maybe after Putin leaves the scene, to bring Russia back into Europe as a European power, as a full-fledged European power. Russia is not an Asian power. And the more we make it an Asian power, the more we push it into becoming a client of China. We're creating, I think, a very, very dangerous situation. And there doesn't seem to be any understanding of this by the Biden administration. I want to talk briefly about the Middle East a little more, Bob, and then I'm going to stop and let you ask questions. The approach of the Biden administration towards the Middle East seems to be to revive the two-state solution and to bring about a ceasefire for the conflict in Gaza and now the conflict with Hezbollah in Lebanon, even though Israel's security concerns have not been addressed. I think we have to be clear that the two-state solution is dead. Israel doesn't want it. I think it's pretty clear that Hamas does not want it either. Hamas wants a one-state solution where the Jews no longer live in Israel, where Hamas, the Palestinians, control everything. I was in Israel earlier this year, and we went to the site of the music festival where this horrific of these tiny kibbutzes, and we saw these homes with these beautiful young couple who were ruthlessly massacred by Hamas fighters coming across the border. They were then followed by residents of Gaza who committed their own atrocities once they crossed into these kibbutzes. We were told over and over again by Israeli officials, we can't have a peace agreement with the Palestinians until they de-radicalize. When we're dealing with another people, an enemy that's teaching their children from the time they're toddlers to hate Jews and to destroy the state of Israel, it's awfully hard to strike a peace agreement with them. We have to have a fundamental change in Palestinian society before we start talking about setting up a parallel state that Hamas will simply use as a springboard to conduct another terrorist attack against the state of Israel. Kamala Harris seems to have no concept of this. She's sticking to the idea of a two-state solution. And I think a Harris administration will be even more hostile towards Israel than the Biden administration is. I give Joe Biden credit because he was in the Senate for decades. He was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was chairman of the committee. He has a history of supporting Israel. I think he's drifted away from that during his presidency, especially over the last year. But there's some residual support of Israel. There's some residual understanding of the conflict. Kamala Harris seems to have none of that. And I'm very concerned, since she's already surrounded herself with advisors who seem to be very hostile towards Israel, very pro-Palestinian, that this would be a very bad development for Israel if Harris was to win the 2024 election. I think if Trump wins, we will have, again, the most pro-Israel president in American history. There will no longer be daylight between the United States and Israel on national security issues. We've seen constant situations where this administration publicly criticizes Israel in the news media. Peace agreements are floated through the media that Israel hasn't been told about. This has to stop. If we have differences with any ally, we deal with them in private. We don't deal with them through the news media. We don't lecture them. We don't threaten them through the press. This is emboldening our enemies to think when they see daylight between us and Israel, they see opportunities. And by Hezbollah, it is emboldening Iran. On Iran, we have to have the return of maximum pressure. Iran was almost bankrupt during the Trump presidency. It is essential that we return to a very tough policy to stop Iran from getting the revenue it needs to build up its military, its nuclear program, its missile program, and its sponsorship of terrorism throughout the region. And states that violate this will be subject to very tough secondary sanctions. I would say, in summary, what we need to do is to return to Trump's approach to U.S. national security, which we call the America First approach to U.S. national security. Now, AFPI put out an important book last May called An America First Approach to U.S. National Security, which I hope your viewers will contributors, 12 different chapters on how Trump's national security approach succeeded during his presidency and how we can bring it back and why we must bring it back to restore American and global security. Thank you.
Fred, thank you. That was an excellent presentation, an amazing overview, a great deal to unpack during the rest of our conversation this morning. Let me say that one of the most important things that I think President Putin has said, and he's said it on a number of occasions, going back more than 20 years, and that is weakness is provocative. And in this case, in Putin's case, weakness is an opportunity, just like it is for Xi, just like it is for the Ayatollahs in Tehran and the dictatorship in Pyongyang. And we can come back to that because I think that's an important theme for our discussion. But let me first go to Dr. Mansourov for his comments and perhaps one or two questions. Alexander, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and greetings to everyone. Fred, what a pleasure to see you again, and what an amazing overview of the land. Really impressive opening for our discussion today. I hope that Ambassador Detrani will feel better and will rejoin us soon. I wish him all the best and quickest recovery. Ambassador Joseph, thank you for your kind introduction. And let me share a couple of observations and then ask a question of our distinguished speaker. First, you know, it's interesting. Everybody coming together and singing Kumbaya, you know, swapping passports, lowering borders, and celebrating our humanity, you know, under the umbrella of U.S. global leadership. And yet today, a few years later, we're seriously talking about the prospect of the Third World War, you know, among nuclear superpowers. threatening to deliver strategic defeat to each other. And I'm just wondering, as a historian, I mean, what happened? Is it really one man's doing? You know, is that person, whoever he may be, President Putin or Xi Jinping or whoever, is so powerful that can change, you know, the trend of history and basically alter the direction of human development from globalization to global war? Or is it the invisible hand or whatever? So I'm just curious. Again, that's not a question, Fred, for you to answer, but something to keep in mind. First. Second, I was really interested in your attributing Russian invasion, quote unquote invasion of Ukraine to American weakness, the deterrence failure and all that. Because we have an exactly mirror image of what's happening in Russia, because the Russian elites believe that it was Russian weakness shown in the past 30 years that led to 5 rounds of NATO expansion, including ultimately and culminated in the events in Ukraine. And it was appeasement of you know, the US-led West that put Russia in the corner, and basically now they're forced to fight that war, not in Latin America, not in Mexico, not in Canada or the Middle East, but in their own backyard, in a place which used to be part of the imperial domain, if you wish. And as a result, I mean, they want to mobilize internally, you know, as you know, they're gearing up for a major arms buildup, arms race. And obviously, they're talking about in a Trumpian we see it as a proxy of the West, made up of 50 countries, which gang together again, like Hitler did, like Napoleon did. And by the way, Ambassador Joseph, that's the danger of historical analogies. I mean, you brought in the analogy with the 1930s, you know, the rise of Hitler, Mussolini, and Imperial Japan, and how it may have led to the outbreak of the Second World War. In Russian today, they also, you know, have this historical mentality. They talk about, you know, Napoleon, Hitler, and how, you know, the failure of appeasement led to attack on Russia, basically saying that they failed. As a matter of fact, under Putin's leadership, you can't blame the Soviet leaders or Gorbachev for that. Putin led that country for 25 years. And so wherever Russia finds itself, it's a result of his policies. Having lost America, having lost Ukraine, having lost the West, that's the result of Putin's policies, not anyone else. But again, that failure of deterrence, as they say, led to that horrible situation. And I agree with President Trump completely. What's happening in Ukraine, it's a human tragedy of unimaginable magnitude. I mean, we're talking about almost 1 million people who dead or maimed or wounded between the two sides, with tremendous physical destruction and all that. I mean, the worst tragedy since the Second World War. So let me ask you one big question to start our discussion. Last week, the Kremlin held what they call an operational meeting of the nuclear deterrence group, at which they discussed the amendments to the Russian nuclear deterrence strategy, because of the sense in the Kremlin that the mutual assured destruction is no longer working. That fear, which used to grip, you know, the superpowers, is gone. Nobody is taking seriously what Russia is saying. about its security needs. And so they decided in that meeting to lower the nuclear use threshold, and specifically now they amended the nuclear deterrence strategy. They revoked the negative security assurances to the non-nuclear states which are members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, saying that if Russia is attacked under a non-nuclear weapon state, anticipation for Russian nuclear retaliation, number one. Number two, of course, they specifically said that if Russia comes under attack not only by missiles, but also strategic and tactical aircraft and unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, that cross the Russian border in en masse and aim at Russian strategic facilities, then that would also be a reason for Russia to use tactical nuclear weapons and possibly strategic nuclear weapons. And finally, they explicitly mentioned any attack on Belarus, a member of the Union State of Russia and Belarus, an ally of Russia, as a matter of fact, that would be also a reason for Russian nuclear attack. Again, the message here is, you can regard it as a nuclear threat or whatever, but they're clearly trying to restore nuclear deterrence in the minds of those who no longer fear it in the camp of their adversaries. And I think that's one of the reasons why President Trump is talking about the growing threat of the Third World War, the nuclear exchange, correctly so. So my question to you is simple. Do you take seriously those changes in the Russian strategic doctrine, strategic nuclear thinking, or do you think Putin is bluffing and basically we can just dismiss it as yet another red line, which he doesn't mean really, which not even red, but maybe pink, maybe not solid, but dotted, and we should keep doing what we're doing, staying the course, supplying long-range missiles to Ukraine, giving them permission to hit Russian cities, because that was the immediate cause that provoked that reevaluation and redefining of Russian nuclear doctrine. So where do you stand, Fred? Is it a bluff or is it a real threat?
Well, it's a lot to talk about here. I wanted to respond to your first comment and concerning multilateralism and Trump. You may remember that when Biden came into office, he said, "America is back." And what he meant was that, many nations didn't like Trump as president. They didn't like the way he ran U.S. foreign policy. He didn't like it when he went to the United Nations and said he would totally destroy North Korea if it threatened our allies. Our European allies didn't like being bossed around to pay their 2% of GDP towards defense. But that doesn't mean he was a bad president on national security. It simply means the world would prefer the United States to be subordinate to the United Nations, to be subordinate to Europe, to be a member of the European club. Remember, Joe Biden once welcomed himself as a member of the European club, which I think was one of the lowest parts of his foreign policy, and that's saying a lot. So I think an assertive American president may not be popular, but is good for global security, and that's what we said. That's what we saw with Trump, and that's not what we have seen with Biden. When you look at the conflict in Ukraine, and I think I agree with a lot of what you said, that many Russian deterrence, and this was telegraphed to the United States before Putin invaded. If you read things Putin had written, he published a long article, I think in the summer of 2021, explaining his philosophy of Russian and Ukrainian history. He believes all kinds of crazy things, that Ukraine is not a state, the Ukrainian people are not a separate people, that it's historically part of Russia. You and I may think that this is nuts, but Putin really believes this. And when Biden simply brushed that off and dangled NATO membership in front of Zelensky, basically he was making the situation worse and worse and worse. And when Putin kept upping the ante, when he kept making it clear that an invasion is coming, Biden just ignored him and said, well, we'll hit you with the greatest sanctions of all time, and we're going to do what we're going to do. And given how weak Biden was, and these continuous efforts to ignore what Putin was saying and Putin's security concerns, that led to the invasion. That does not justify the invasion. Biden's incompetence did not justify this massacre the Russians have conducted in Ukraine, but it was avoidable. We could have conducted diplomacy in January of 2021, January of 2022, December of 2021, and prevented this from happening. We simply ignored what Putin was saying. Even as the tanks were coming up to the border, Biden did almost nothing. Well, he did send Kamala Harris to a conference in Germany just before the invasion that was completely pointless. So what we're seeing now is as the war progresses, and as the Ukrainians are threatening to fire missiles deeper and deeper in Russian territory, the Russians are thinking about nuclear responses. And the Biden administration is Trump as a possible World War III situation. He thinks it's possible that if you push Putin hard enough, he will use tactical nuclear weapons. He will go nuclear, and who knows what else he will evade. You know, I'm with people who believe that Putin invaded Ukraine because of his peculiar views of Ukraine as a state and as Russia, but he also did not want Ukraine being part of NATO. He thought this was a threat to Russian security and Russian society. I don't think Putin ever intended to invade other nations in NATO after he went into Ukraine. And people who say that have no foundation for saying that. But I don't know where things are going now. If Putin is thinking of going nuclear, it could change the whole equation. We need competent leaders in there who will really de-escalate the situation, come up with a negotiated solution, and stop ignoring Putin when he makes these threats. We simply shouldn't write them off to assume that he's bluffing. He might not be bluffing.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you, Fred.
Fred, thank you. Let me dig a little bit deeper on a topic that both you and Alexandre have raised, and that is deterrence. There was a Wall Street Journal editorial last week, I'm sure you saw it, talking about the collapse of the credibility of the US deterrent, leading to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, leading to the acceleration of activities in the South China Sea and directly against our allies, whether it be Philippines or Taiwan, leading to the Iranian Ayatollahs pushing faster and harder for a nuclear weapon capability. My question is, how do we restore deterrence? And this was in part a topic that was taken up by one of the commissions that I mentioned, the Commission on the Strategic Posture. And part of restoring our deterrent credibility has to do with our capability. And we see China building up its nuclear weapons capability at what has been described by a previous commander at Stratcom as breathtaking, a breathtaking expansion of their capabilities. We see the changes in Russia's posture. And in my view, Russia has achieved superiority over the United States on nuclear forces a long time ago, and they continue to build on that. So what the Commission recommends is that we consider more nuclear weapons. We have to have more nuclear weapons because numbers and types matter in this, in restoring the credibility of our deterrent. I think there would be a great deal of resistance. There clearly is in the Biden administration and probably in a Vice President Harris to the real world threat, especially when you consider Russia and China working together. And you mentioned the growth in their interrelationships into what is almost a formal alliance. Would a Trump administration have a different approach on nuclear? And also, It's not just the offensive capability, it's the defensive capability. And we have let our missile defense capability for the homeland, our strategic defense capability, atrophy over the course of 20 years. We have little more capability today than we did when we first reached IOC in October of 2004. I think it's it's not just a shame, it's a scandal. And what the commission talks about is exploring new capabilities. And I think all of us who have worked in the area of strategic defenses understand that that means a space-based capability. Do you think that a Trump administration, and I know you don't speak for the Trump administration, but in your view, would a Trump administration likely be open to moving to a space-based capability, given that President Trump has said that what we need is an effective missile defense component? So, Fred, let me get your reaction to that, not just on the capability side, but on the credibility of our policy side. And that seems to be where the Biden administration has so greatly weakened our credibility for deterrence. So let me ask you to respond.
These are great questions, Bob. And as you and I know, our nuclear arsenal is deteriorating. Many of our weapons are way past their end of service date and have been continually extended, some using very old software packages that even you and I would not know how to operate. It's a real problem. I mean, there's a little bit of good news in that nuclear modernization efforts and missile defense spending that were begun under the Biden administration. I mean, under the Trump administration. The Biden administration wanted to cancel them, but fortunately, there are some conservative Democrats in the Senate who wouldn't let that happen. It hasn't kept up with inflation. An awful lot more has to be done. And I believe there will be a significant expansion under a new Trump administration to modernize and expand our nuclear arsenal and deal with missile defense. I don't know whether the Trump administration will support a space-based defense. It's something that I favor, and I think that you've made a good argument for that. But at the end of the day, we have to talk about restoring deterrence with strong leadership. Now, this obviously starts at the top with a serious president who our enemies further than that. This president has to put together an extremely capable and tough national security team. We don't have that right now. We have third stringers at best running our national security. I'm happy to tell you, Bob, that I know of a large number of very good national security experts who are lining up to work for Donald Trump if he wins the election, to salvage our national security, our nuclear arsenal, missile defense, really good people who I think will be able to hit the ground running to make a real difference on this, because Trump will only be president for 4 years. That means he has 2.5 years probably to get anything done. So as I said, it's not just the commander-in-chief, it's a strong team, and I'm very optimistic.
I couldn't agree more on your point about leadership. It's absolutely essential to the credibility of deterrence, and deterrence is an essential component of achieving a national defense posture, national security posture that not only deters wars, but protects U.S. interests abroad and at home. I would just make one comment on your comment, Fred, and that is, yes, spending has to increase, but we have to spend it on the right things. We can, as a government, and we've demonstrated this over and over, we can spend a lot of money on the wrong things that don't provide for enhancing our strength, enhancing our deterrent capability. It's getting the right programs and the right policies in place that are so essential. Let me ask one more question, Fred, and that has to do with alliances, which are another critical component of our national security posture. There is a lot of concern. I returned from Seoul last night. There is a lot of concern in Asia about a possible Trump administration coming into office, concerned over how much pressure that would place on allies to spend more on defense is part of that. And certainly you've seen that in terms of NATO discussions in Europe. What is your sort of sense of how a Trump administration would manage our alliances?
I was recently in Taiwan, Japan, and South there, and they're very concerned. And I think one reason they're concerned is because there are people who claim they're speaking for Trump, or they think the Trump advisors, and they're not. And they're saying really irresponsible things. You and I don't know what Donald Trump will do in terms of alliances. And I think we have to be careful when we speculate. But I will say that a strong relationship with South Korea and Japan, I am certain that is something that Donald Trump will want to continue as president. He had a very strong relationship with these countries when he was president the first time. Advice from Prime Minister Abe was crucial in Trump's personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, and I think that relationship is going to be very strong. There's going to be difficult discussions about members of alliances carrying their own weight. I think those discussions are going to be toughest with NATO nations that are refusing to pay 2% of GDP towards military spending. When it comes to South Korea and Japan, I think the priority is going to be standing up to this new Russia, China, Iran, North Korea axis. There will be some discussions about how much they pay in terms of U.S. troops in their countries. But I think that's going to be a discussion among friends. The real focus is this enormous security threat by this China-Russia axis. And that's what I told my friends out there. And I also said, don't believe everything you hear from people who claim to be speaking for Trump.
Fred, thank you. That was an excellent answer. I do hope we'll have enough time to explore Iran and the Iranian nuclear program. But I did want to go back to Alexander for his comment and I think another question.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Ambassador. Fred, now let me ask you a curveball question related to Iran, an honorary member of that axis of evil. Now, in the past few months and way before that, we saw some brilliant intelligence operations, as you mentioned, by our Israeli friends. I would use the word neutralization, if you know what I mean. Neutralization of Commander Soleimani, then the mysterious death of President Raisi, then neutralization of Hamas leader Haniyeh and Hezbollah leader Nasrallah. And every time, we heard some big mouth threats and promises of retaliation from Tehran, and yet nothing happened. And that leaves some people wondering, what's going on in Iran? I'll give you three possible explanations very briefly. The first one is that, maybe there is some big cunning plan of the Ayatollahs behind it. They're kind of mobilizing all the resources for really a crushing strike against Israel in the days to come to retaliate. Number one. Number two, no, they're scared. They just put Ayatollah somewhere in the basement, trying to basically protect the rear ends. They're so scared. And number three, the third explanation is, you know what? They have a new leadership there. President Pezeshkian said he wants to improve relations with the United States and the West. His foreign policy advisor, former Iranian chief nuclear negotiator, is very explicit about the interest in Iran to normalize relations with the West. And if you read what Pezeshkian said in New York, he said, you know what? He condemned Russian actions in Ukraine. He said Iran is not going to supply any missiles to Iran. The former leader did. He stopped all that. So it's a new beginning. It's a new beginning for Iran, and that's why you don't see any retaliation. If anything, Iran is shedding off its quote-unquote toxic assets, whether it's Hezbollah or Hamas or IRGC's unruly commanders. So my question to you is very simple. What's going on there? Is Iran's threat declining to us? I mean, are we exaggerating Iranian threat given their behavior or lack of behavior, lack of action? I mean, is Iran a paper lion? Although, we keep talking about the cyber threat and all that, but really, I mean, what else can to kind of nudge that lion into action? So what's your take on it? Are we really exaggerating here the Iranian threat? Are we, again, misreading some signals which they're sending to us, just like we did with Putin? Or am I too naive? And really, there is some big cunning plan behind it. One day they'll unleash it and we'll all suffer. What do you think?
Well, I think Iran remains a state sponsor of terror, and I'm reluctant to think that his policy has changed because of the new Iranian president, because Supreme Leader Khamenei calls the shots. We've seen so-called moderate Iranian presidents, and the terrorism continued, their missile program continued. There has been a huge surge in Iran's nuclear program since Joe Biden came into office. It's now enriching uranium to 60% uranium hexafluoride. It could probably have a nuclear weapon it could test within 9 months to a year. This is far too close for me. And I think the closer Iran gets to a nuclear weapon that it can test, the greater the possibility of a major Israeli strike against Iran. I think Iran is regrouping right now. It was really taken off guard when Israel attacked that airbase near the Natanz nuclear facility and demonstrate its ability to strike any location in Iran with impunity. And after the killing of the head of Hezbollah, you're right, Khamenei is now in hiding in a secure location because the Iranians are worried what the Israelis would do. I don't think the Iranians are going to back down. I think they're regrouping and considering their options. I don't think they anticipated that Hezbollah would be hit this hard and might be crippled by this effort by Israel, the effort to take out its leadership, the exploding pagers. But I think Iran is still a very dangerous state sponsor of terror. It will come up with new ways to conduct acts of terror unless there's some way to really rein it in, cut back its revenue, and the reestablishment of American deterrence on the global scene. So I don't think the Iranian threat has gone away. I don't believe the Iranian president means that Iran is going to suddenly become a more reasonable state. But I do think global deterrence will be the key to getting Iran to move in a different direction, and we're not there yet.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Fred, let me just pursue that a little bit more in depth. I mean, I'm convinced that Iran, as the chief backer, the chief participant in international terrorism, as well as its regional aggression, as well as its missile and, most importantly, nuclear program, concerning all of those, I think the only real solution will be the end of the religious dictatorship and its replacement by the people of Iran seeking a peaceful, democratic, and hopefully secular Iran. And I think that's clearly in our interests. And there are parallels, I think, with North Korea, and I think we should give North Korea a bit more of attention in our discussion. A recent RAND report suggests that North Korea could have as many as 200 nuclear weapons by 2027. 2027, a blink of an eye from now. North Korea has a record of selling to the highest bidder anything that it produces. And so the expectation or the concern that North Korea might sell a nuclear weapon to another rogue state or even to a terrorist entity is a real concern in my view. And here again, my sense is that the only way only way to, with regard to nuclear threats, with regard to regional aggression, with regard to the crimes against humanity, that are perpetrated on its own people, whether it's Iran or North Korea, is to replace the regime, not by military invasion, but through the change that comes from the people of Iran and North Korea. Do you think that either candidate for president is prepared to support the people of Iran or the people of North Korea in achieving a different regime, a different government that is much more attuned to US interests and to international peace, quite frankly?
Well, I want to first talk about North Korea because the threat from North Korea has really surged during this administration because of a policy of neglect. Joe Biden didn't like Donald Trump's personal diplomacy with Kim Jong-un, and he's basically ignored North Korea through his presidency until last year when the missile test got very bad. We had a part-time special envoy for North Korea. He also was ambassador to Indonesia. He resigned last December. The office is still vacant. This is a nation, as you said, with a rapidly expanding nuclear arsenal, and this administration has paid almost no attention to it. I don't know how we're going to change the regime in North Korea. That certainly would be the ideal situation. But I think engaging them through diplomacy like Trump did an awful lot to lower tensions. And I think Trump will resume bilateral diplomacy with North Korea, a presidential level diplomacy, to try to lower tensions. Concerning Iran, Trump has offered to meet with Iranian leaders too, and the Iranians were never interested. And I think this simply is part of his approach of being tough with our allies and bankrupting them if he has to, but also being willing to talk to them. I think Trump would be supportive of supporting the Iranian people. I think the vast majority of which would like to throw the mullahs out. But I think the first step is to lower tensions, to bankrupt Iran, and to stop nations trading with Iran, not just revenue that it would use, but technology that it's using to build up its missile program and its nuclear program. As you know, Iran is the largest missile arsenal in the Middle East. It is trying to build ICBMs that they can currently hit Western Europe. Eventually, they'll be able to hit the United States. This is a situation we can't let go on.
Exactly. I must say, though, Fred, that I don't share your optimism with regard to negotiations with the North Korean regime. I think they have used for over 30 years this notion that we can negotiate an agreement. They've used that as a means of expanding their own program. And as we know, very much evident, they are producing as much fissile material for as many, and that continues whether we have negotiations or we don't have negotiations. What is the ultimate importance is that we protect ourselves from that threat, near term, midterm, and longer term. And I think that any new administration is going to have to deal with that. I think you're right. This Biden administration has pretty much ignored the North Korea threat as it has metastasized into what it is today, and it's a very scary tomorrow when one's looking at
Bob,
that.
let's build on that a little bit. You and I have allies who really like to bomb North Korea and Iran, and a central focus of Trump is that we're going to be tough with our enemies, but we're not going to get our soldiers in new and unnecessary wars. We're going to use diplomacy where we can to lower tensions. And Trump's diplomacy with North Korea was extremely successful. We haven't had a North Korean nuclear test since September of 2017. Long-range missile tests stopped until 2022. Now, I know that their missile program, the nuclear program, continued behind the scenes, but tensions were lowered significantly by Trump's diplomacy, and he didn't make the concessions that all these other Republican and Democratic administrations made. So you can argue it wasn't fully successful, but I would argue Trump achieved a lot, and he'll achieve even more if he's back in office.
Fred, I'm going to have to cut you off. I will say that I hope I wasn't misunderstood. I'm not advocating the use of military force against Iran or North Korea to change the regime. I think that has to come from within. But Fred and Alexandre, I want to thank both of you, Fred in particular, you as our guest panelist, for a very insightful, very informative discussion. I think that our viewers will benefit from your perspectives and your insights as they consider the future, and in particular, as we look toward next month's election. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Jenkins.
Thank you, Ambassador. Wonderful moderation. Had a wonderful program. And Alexander, we're so happy that you also bring very key questions to the floor. And Fred, this was an excellent program. We'll be inviting you back very soon. I want to thank the Washington Times, Guy Taylor and Chris Dolan for covering this program, and it many times goes into our new daily report on threat status that goes all over Washington and all over the nation. And we're really looking forward to our efforts, peace and understanding to the Korean Peninsula, as well as the Middle East. And we're all in to do that. I do believe that President Trump will make a huge advancement towards those goals if he comes back. And I think he's coming back, and I certainly support that. We want to thank you all for this program. Kira and our tech team, thank you so much, and have a wonderful week.
Thank you all.
Thank you.